Ever felt stuck in a job where they just keep piling on the work and not the rewards? Well, I found a way to turn the tables, make them pay me to do nothing, and walk away victorious. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one ends.
Let me tell you a story. It's a bit of a wild ride, honestly, and it's one of those stories that I look back on and can't help but chuckle. I guess you could call it the tale of how one small decision and a bit of spite ended up putting me in a pretty crazy situation for a good chunk of my life. But before we get to the juicy part, let me introduce myself. My name's Jake Mitchell, and I worked in IT. Yeah, not the most glamorous job, right? But you'd be surprised at how much chaos can be hidden behind a computer screen, especially when you're working in the middle of the oil patch in northern Canada. Most people don't really think about it, but those massive oil companies need technology to run smoothly. And when it doesn't, well, let me tell you, it gets ugly fast. Now, let's rewind a bit to about a decade ago. I was working for a small IT company that had this sweet contract with Northern Petroleum, one of the big players in the oil world. My job? I maintained the virtual meeting rooms. Sounds pretty chill, right? Well, it was, until everything started to fall apart. So the oil company decided that if you didn't need to be physically on site, they'd move your job south and pay you significantly less. The logic was that if you didn't need to be there in person, you shouldn't be paid like you were. Fair enough, I guess, but for me and the rest of my team, that meant about a 25 to 50% pay cut. But hey, it was still work. We had to keep our heads down and get things done, right? It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't the worst thing. But here's where it gets interesting and frustrating. My IT company, let's call it TechMasters, was doing a pretty solid job managing all the virtual meetings. Everything was running smoothly. Everyone was happy. But then, out of nowhere, Northern Petroleum decided to switch things up. They handed the contract over to this massive international IT company. Let's call them Tech Global. And well, that's when everything went south. I was one of the lucky few who managed to land a spot with Tech Global. Let's just say it wasn't exactly the dream job. Most of the experienced tech folks from TechMasters walked away, and to be honest, I didn't blame them. Tech Global's approach was completely different. They took a bunch of fresh out of college kids and shoved them into roles that they had no business being in. I'm talking about people who couldn't even figure out the difference between an HDMI cable and a network cable, let alone understand how to fix virtual meeting rooms. So within a few months, our ticket count skyrocketed. We went from handling a manageable 50 tickets to over 600, and it was only getting worse. And if you've ever worked in IT, you know that ticket counts are like a weight on your shoulders. You're constantly being told you're either closing too many too quickly or not closing enough fast enough. You can't win. And Tech Global? They didn't care that we were drowning. They just kept pushing harder. The worst part? We were getting fined by Northern Petroleum for every ticket we didn't resolve within the required time. I mean, seriously, they were basically just waiting for us to mess up so they could pocket the fines. And meanwhile, the salaried folks at Northern Petroleum who had issues with their computers, they could take weeks or even months to get their problems fixed, and no one cared. It didn't affect production, so it didn't matter. Except, of course, for the virtual meetings. Now, here's the kicker. Those virtual meetings were the lifeblood of the business. If the executives couldn't meet and discuss decisions, nothing was moving forward. If the VPs, directors, or whoever else couldn't sit down for a virtual meeting, the oil wasn't coming out of the ground. Simple as that. And that, my friends, is when things really started to go sideways. So imagine this. A team of 12 people, all trying to make sure these virtual meetings go off without a hitch. But here's the problem. We were supposed to check the meeting rooms, make sure everything was set up, stocked with supplies, and ready to go. But here's the catch. We didn't have the vehicles to get to all the rooms. We had 6 vehicles for the whole team, but Bradley Harris, my supervisor, decided to keep one of them for himself. And I'm not talking about just any vehicle. He was driving it from town and refusing to let anyone else use it during the day. So now we're down to 5 vehicles for the whole team.
The whole idea was that we were supposed to check the rooms when we didn't have tickets, but how are you supposed to get to them if you don't have a car? Simple answer, you don't. So we were just driving by the buildings, hoping the rooms weren't in use. But that wasn't enough. The new guys who were supposed to show up and facilitate these meetings, they were just dropping the ball. And when they didn't show up, the meetings failed. Everything was a mess. During this whole time, I had been loudly complaining about the impossible situation we were in. I kept saying, how are we supposed to check all these meeting rooms when we don't even have the cars to get there? But every time I spoke up, it felt like it fell on deaf ears. One day, a coworker of mine told me something that just about broke me. One of Tech Global's managers had come up to review the situation. He was at lunch, looked at one of my emails, and said, "I'm not reading that," tossed his phone down, and went back to his meal. No surprise, right? At that point, I just threw my hands up. I gave in. I did what I was told. Now, I had been busting my ass for months, trying to keep everything running smoothly for Northern Petroleum's executives. And that's when I had what I like to call my moment of malicious compliance. It was time to stop doing things the way they wanted and do things the way I wanted. So at this point, I had had enough. I had already been pulling more than my fair share, trying to fix issues for executives while managing an impossible workload with barely any resources. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the system wasn't working for anyone. But here's the thing. I didn't have to work within that broken system. If they weren't going to listen to reason, I was going to play their game. But I'd do it my way. The situation had become so absurd that I decided to pull a little malicious compliance. You see, we had a building in town that housed a few meeting rooms, and our main building was located 45 minutes north. Our job was to check the meeting rooms every week, and I was told to report back every time I did so. Now here's where things got tricky. I had to check the meeting rooms, and we didn't have enough vehicles to do it. The new team members were busy running around with tickets, but they weren't getting much done because they didn't know the system and had no training. That meant the responsibility fell on me. I came up with a brilliant plan. I decided that I would follow the directions, but I wasn't going to go out of my way to actually do the job the way it was expected. Oh, I'd check the meeting rooms all right, but I wasn't going to waste my time driving all over the place. Instead, I took it upon myself to do the absolute bare minimum, just enough to check the box and get it off my plate. Every day, I'd go to the town building, which was supposed to have a meeting room I was responsible for. But guess what? It was always in use. So, what did I do? I didn't just stand there frustrated. I took a photo of the room from the outside, scanned the QR code, and boom, job done. Then I'd drive up to the Northern Petroleum site 45 minutes north and start working on tickets for the day. At the end of the day, I'd leave at 2 p.m. to go back to that same meeting room in town, one that I still couldn't get into because, you guessed it, it was still in use. So I'd scan the QR code from the outside, report that I had checked it, and head home. This went on for a month. A solid month of doing absolutely nothing except clicking the scan button every now and then to show that I was, quote, checking the rooms. I wasn't making meetings run more smoothly. I wasn't fixing problems. I was simply doing what I was told to do, and no more. I scanned the QR codes, I filed the reports, and most importantly, I did it all in the most compliant way possible. And it worked. It worked so well, in fact, that after a while, the Northern Petroleum executives started noticing that things weren't exactly running as smoothly as they should have been. Meetings were still failing left and right. The new people brought in by Tech Global couldn't keep up with the expectations, and all of a sudden, the X realized that I was one of the only ones actually making things happen. They started calling on me more and more, because unlike everyone else, I knew how to keep the meetings running smoothly. Then came the call, the big one. The execs at Northern Petroleum were fed up with the constant failures and delays. They had already been hearing complaints about how poorly things were running with Tech Global, but this was the final straw.
They called in my supervisor, Bradley Harris, the manager, and his boss, the bigwigs from both sides. And guess what? They called me in too. I was called into a meeting with my supervisor and his bosses, and that's when the real fun started. The Northern Petroleum executives made it clear that something had to change. They couldn't keep dealing with these failed meetings, and they wanted answers. The higher-ups from Tech Global were there, and they knew the situation was dire. That's when they decided to fix things. They decided that Jake Mitchell, the guy who had been barely doing the bare minimum, was now going to take on a special role. Here's the kicker. Tech Global told me that I was now going to be solely responsible for all the meeting rooms and the executive meetings. The job that used to be handled by 4 people was now just mine. They handed me a vehicle, told me to check all the rooms every week, and take care of all the meetings. This wasn't just a slight change. It was a full-on shift in responsibility. I told Bradley Harris right then and there, this isn't physically possible. You're asking me to be in multiple places at once. But of course, Bradley didn't care. He didn't want to hear it. All he cared about was getting the job done. And how I did it didn't matter. He just said, get it done. Well, I got it done all right, but I did it my way, the way that wouldn't take up too much of my time and effort. Every time I checked a room, I had to scan a QR code on a company phone. The system was supposed to track the rooms I checked, so all I had to do was export the data into Excel at the end of the week. So that's exactly what I did. Here's where the malicious compliance kicked into full gear. I'd click that scan button like it was my job, but I wasn't actually in the rooms. I'd scan the code even if I wasn't anywhere near the building. I'd scan it when I was 30 kilometers north of town, then 70 kilometers across the river, and then when I was home, scanning again. Every time I exported the list, I would randomize the room codes, paste them in, save it, and submit it. No one ever knew that I was scanning codes and doing nothing. It was the perfect system for me. I got to start my day late and leave early. I only worked on the meetings, and since the executives saw me as the only one who actually made meetings work, they were happy. They didn't care how I got the job done as long as it was done. As for the rest of the team, they were still struggling to get anything done. As the weeks went on, I became more and more comfortable with the rhythm of my malicious compliance. Honestly, it felt a little like I had gamed the system, but hey, if they weren't going to listen to reason, then I wasn't about to waste my energy doing more than what was asked. As I coasted through the days, my workload kept getting lighter. I had my own vehicle, I showed up late, left early, and all the while I was technically doing the job I was assigned to do. After all, I was checking the rooms and making sure the virtual meetings ran smoothly for the execs. At least that's what the reports said. I didn't have to worry about the other tasks that had been handed to me, the ones that would have kept me running around with my head spinning. The rest of the team, like Kyle Miller and Rachel Lee, were still scrambling to get tickets closed, trying to keep up with the mountain of unresolved issues. I'd show up for the occasional ticket, but the main thing I focused on was making sure the executives were happy. They didn't care what I did during the rest of the day. As long as the meetings went off without a hitch, they were satisfied.
Here's the thing. Tech Global didn't realize the massive hole they were digging themselves into. They were so caught up in trying to keep the contract, they failed to see the root cause of their problems. Sure, they threw more bodies at the problem, new hires, fresh graduates who didn't have a clue about the oil patch or the specifics of virtual meetings. And they made me the scapegoat. I became the only person who actually had a clue about what was going on. I wasn't the hero they wanted, but I was the hero they needed. But I wasn't sticking around forever. I had been planning my escape for months. See, while I was breezing through my work, I had also applied for a new job, a better job, one that didn't involve me constantly looking over my shoulder or dealing with inept managers. The offer was already on the table, and my start date was set for about 6 months out. So I had time. I had a lot of time.
Now, as much as I hated the situation I was in, I had to admit there were some perks to my arrangement. I was still being invited to all the social events that Tech Global and Northern Petroleum threw. I had a good rapport with the execs, and honestly, they kind of appreciated the fact that I was the only one getting stuff done. But here's the thing, those social events, they were just a distraction. I didn't need to be at those events. I didn't need to be seen as some kind of IT wizard. All I cared about was getting the paycheck, keeping my head low, and finishing up my work without putting too much of my soul into it. One night, I found myself at one of these social events, and it was a bit surreal. The room was filled with people who had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. All they knew was that they were making money, and the execs were happy. No one cared that the IT department was bleeding money. No one cared that Tech Global was hemorrhaging funds to Northern Petroleum because of fines and unmet expectations. They were just happy that everything looked good on the surface. And then it hit me. I had played this system, and I had done it well. The longer I stayed, the more the cracks started showing. More and more people were leaving. The talented individuals who had stuck around for so long were finally fed up. They couldn't take the mismanagement, the incompetence, and the frustrating lack of understanding about the job. They had given up. And I realized I was about to give up too. I wasn't going to be the guy who stuck around and let this disaster drag me down. It was time to make my move. As I said, I had already applied for a new job, and by this time the process had gone through smoothly. They had accepted me, I'd signed the offer, and the start date was set. It was going to be the kind of opportunity that would actually allow me to grow, where I wouldn't have to deal with constant chaos. I had my 3-week vacation coming up, so I decided I'd use that time to finally escape. But here's the best part. I didn't just leave quietly. No, I wanted to make sure that the company realized just how messed up everything had become. So, on my last day, just before my vacation, I handed in my resignation, a full 3 weeks before my planned departure. I didn't just quit and disappear into the night. I made sure to let everyone know that I was done. That was my final mic drop. The funny thing? Everyone at Tech Global thought they had it all figured out. They brought in more people. They thought that by throwing bodies at the problem, it would somehow magically fix itself. They even tried to put a team of 4 on meeting rooms. But you know what? They still couldn't get it done. Why? Because no one had bothered to actually learn the systems. No one understood the intricacies of the work we were doing, and it showed. They failed. Big time. Eventually, Tech Global lost the contract to Northern Petroleum. The executives at Northern Petroleum were finally fed up with the inefficiencies and decided it was time to switch things up. They called in a new IT company, one that actually knew what they were doing. But by then, I had already walked away. I was long gone.
For me, it was a bittersweet ending. I had made it out, but it wasn't without a fair share of scars. I learned a lot during my time at Tech Global, about the way companies operate, about the importance of standing your ground, and about how sometimes just playing the game the right way can be the best form of resistance. I had been pushed to the brink, but in the end, I came out on top. And while I don't regret my decision to leave, I can't help but look back and laugh at how it all played out. From the day I decided to play the system to the day I handed in my resignation, everything fell into place perfectly. It was a story of survival, strategy, and, above all, making sure I didn't let anyone walk all over me. I'd had enough of being treated like a cog in the machine, and when I left, I made sure to walk out with my head held high. That's my story. It's a reminder that sometimes when you're stuck in a messed up situation, the best thing you can do is play the game. Just don't play by their rules. Play by your own. And when the system falls apart, well, you'll be the one walking away. After I handed in my resignation, things didn't immediately go back to normal.
For a while, I kept thinking, maybe I made the wrong decision. Maybe I should have stayed a little longer. But deep down, I knew I was done. My time at Tech Global had been a masterclass in frustration, absurdity, and, oddly enough, self-discovery. The first few days after leaving felt like I had been given a fresh start, like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. No more worrying about tickets, no more chasing after meeting rooms, no more dealing with clueless managers or techs who couldn't find their way out of a paper bag. It was like stepping out of a nightmare and into the daylight. The new job? Well, it wasn't just a fresh start. It was everything I had been missing. It was structured, efficient, and, most importantly, people actually knew what they were doing. No more chaos. No more playing the system just to survive. I still kept in touch with a few of the people I had worked with at Tech Global. Surprisingly, a couple of them ended up leaving too, realizing that they weren't going to get anywhere by staying in a company that was running on fumes. I remember one of them, Kyle Miller, telling me that he had been offered a position at a competitor and had finally taken it. He mentioned how he could feel the atmosphere changing, like everyone was walking around with that same "I'm out of here soon" vibe. The writing was on the wall, but for some people it took longer to read it than others. Rachel Lee, another coworker, kept telling me how hard it was to watch the company burn. She stayed on for a while, trying to make things work, but eventually the stress just wore her down. She ended up in a completely different field altogether. It wasn't that she didn't love IT, she did, but after seeing how poorly everything was run at Tech Global, it made her rethink her entire career trajectory. But for me, after all the games I had played and all the petty frustrations I had dealt with, I couldn't help but feel a bit of a rush when I walked away. Yeah, I had pulled some dirty tricks, but at the end of the day, I wasn't the one who had let the whole situation get out of hand. I was the one who survived it, and that's a pretty damn good feeling. Sometimes survival is about knowing when to fight and when to just sit back and watch it all implode. By the time Tech Global lost the contract to Northern Petroleum, I was already fully settled into my new job. It felt almost surreal hearing that the company I had just left had lost the contract. The executives at Northern Petroleum must have been ready to pull their hair out, considering how poorly Tech Global had handled the situation. But honestly, I wasn't surprised. You can only cut corners for so long before it all falls apart. Looking back now, I see it for what it was, a perfect storm of mismanagement, incompetence, and complete disregard for the people who were actually keeping the wheels turning. They had no idea what they were doing, and the people who did, well, they were all pushed to the brink. When I was still there, I used to think that things would eventually get better, but after a while, I realized that they weren't trying to fix things, they were just trying to get by. And that's the problem with a company that doesn't care about its employees. The employees stop caring about the company. They stop giving their best, because, frankly, why should they? They're not being valued, they're just being used. For me, though, that was the turning point. I stopped giving my all to a company that didn't deserve it. Sure, I played the game, but I played it on my terms. And by the time I walked away, I had no regrets. I had learned to put myself first, and that was the lesson I took with me into the future. The executives at Northern Petroleum? Well, they eventually figured it out, and the whole debacle was swept under the rug, as these things usually are. But I'd like to think that they learned something too. Maybe they realized that you can't just throw a bunch of unqualified people into positions and expect everything to run smoothly. Maybe they realized that without experienced and dedicated employees, things don't get done. Or maybe they didn't. Who knows? I'm sure Tech Global had a few more contracts that failed before they lost that one for good. The oil industry is cutthroat, and when you don't take care of the details, it will leave you behind in the dust. But as for me, I moved on. I moved forward. And I had a feeling that the lessons I learned at Tech Global would stick with me for a long time. Don't let yourself be a cog in the machine. Don't let yourself be a part of a broken system. And most importantly, don't let someone take advantage of you when you know you're worth more. It took me a while to get there, but when I finally made the decision to leave, I knew it was the right one. And I guess that's the moral of this story. It's not about how hard you work or how much you put in. It's about knowing when to walk away. Life is too short to get caught in a situation where you're just burning yourself out for nothing. Sometimes you've got to stop playing by their rules and start playing by your own. When you do that, that's when you truly take control of your life. I walked away from Tech Global, but more importantly, I walked away with the knowledge that I had the power to change my own path. And that's priceless.
If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Thanks for watching.